The following program is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network, available on the free YouTube channel General Grant by himself or Dr. E.C. Thiels, and on the Facebook page Kurt Thiels as General Grant, and on various other social media. The website is generalgrantbyhimself.com. This program is one of those presentations in the ongoing series General Grant Looks at the American Civil War, wherein General Grant looks at a person, place, or event in the Civil War for reflection and observation. Permission to copy and distribute is given and indeed encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. And now, General Grant reflects on the Peace Conference of February 3rd, 1865. I'm Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, and you join me today in my parlor. And I would like to reflect and review a little bit about the not so well known Peace Conference of February the 3rd of 1865. Very late war effort, but nevertheless it was significant in that it was an effort to stop the fighting, stop the bloodshed. This starts, actually it goes all through the war with some people in Richmond trying to bring about peace as early as 61 and all through the war. But there was one particular individual who played a significant role in the Peace Conference, and that was Francis P. Blair Sr. Now, he was a key figure in Washington and well connected. He had been a member of President Andrew Jackson's kitchen cabinet. He'd been a personal friend of Jefferson Davis for 43 years and had indeed visited with him through the war. He also had a son who was the Postmaster General in Lincoln's cabinet. He had another son that was a general in the United States Army. So he was also the emissary from President Lincoln, who took the offer to Robert E. Lee for command of all federal forces. He's a man well connected and well known in Washington circles, and he was eager to bring about a peace armistice or a cessation of the fighting. President Lincoln was aware of him, and the timing was right. He had been reelected in November. We had taken Savannah, we had taken Nashville, the Battle of Nashville, Fort Fisher. Everything was in Lincoln's favor to negotiate from a position of strength. And he was inclined to listen to Frank Blair, urge him to send an overture to Jefferson Davis. But let me share with you something that the president had said not long after he was elected. Or actually, he said this in July of 1864. To whom it may concern, any proposition which embraces the restoration of peace, the integrity of the whole Union, and the abandonment of slavery, and which comes by and with authority that can control the armies now at war against the United States, will be received and considered by the executive government of the United States, and will be met with or by liberal terms on other substantial and collateral points, and the bearer or bearers thereof shall have safe conduct both ways. And this was put out in cooperation with Horace Greeley through his newspapers. And that was in July of '64, when things were not looking so good for President Lincoln's reelection. But he called Francis P. Blair Sr., to the White House on December the 28th of 1864 and met with him, and Secretary Seward was there, and they sent him to, by Jefferson Davis's invitation, conveyed through Blair to Lincoln. Lincoln sent Blair back to Jefferson Davis to talk about a meeting for a peace conference. And it was top secret, obviously, and President Lincoln and Seward both made it clear to Seward, we will deny any involvement in this at any time if this should get out. And of course it did get out. It was a very poorly kept secret in Washington City. But he sent an overture in mid-December before he met with Blair on the 28th, and Davis replied with this statement: I am willing now, as heretofore, to enter into negotiations for the restoration of peace, and am ready to send a commission with a view to secure peace for the two countries. Lincoln, when he got that message back, sent this reply: You may say to him that I have constantly been, and now, and shall continue, ready to receive any agent whom he or any other influential person now resisting the national authority may informally send to me with a view to securing peace to the people of our common country. See, Davis had said secure peace to the two countries. That ground on Lincoln, who never accepted the Confederacy as a separate country, and he emphasized our common country. And Blair went back to see Davis, and in fact, Gideon Wells furnished a U.S. Navy war vessel to carry him down the river almost all the way to Richmond, and then he got on land and through the lines with safe passage and go and meet with Davis. Now, Blair's prejudice was he wanted to propose that the North and South come together with an armistice, join together, and oust the French from Mexico. Lincoln had no time for that, and neither did Davis, but that was Blair's pet project. But he told Davis when they were talking at the Confederate White House that Lincoln really wants to talk. He's flexible. He wants to hear what you've got to say. And he misled Davis. Davis, his pet project was total independence. Anything less than recognition of the Confederate States of America was he considered to be an unconditional surrender. But he had the understanding from Lincoln through Blair that that's a non-negotiable point. You've got to recognize that you're one country. You've got to recognize the authority of the United States over one country. Slavery is a dead issue. The 13th Amendment had been passed the end of the month before in December. It's a dead issue. Surely you people realize, was his wording, that slavery is no more. It's dead. But Davis was wanting to negotiate with Lincoln, if for nothing else, so he could show the people of the Confederacy, see how hard-headed they are. He was going to use it at minimum as a promotional ploy to try to boost flagging spirits. And the Confederacy was already dead on its feet. It just didn't know it yet. However, Davis agreed to send commissioners. Now, the three commissioners that went were Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, Senator Robert Hunter, who had been a United States senator and was now a Confederate States senator, and Judge John Campbell, who was an ardent peace pusher, who really wanted to stop the fighting. He'd been a United States Supreme Court Associate Justice from 1853 to 1861 when he wasn't able to stop the war, and he resigned and went to Alabama, and then he went to Texas. But and he was then Assistant Secretary of War for the Confederacy. So very astute man, Supreme Court Justice, Senator, U.S. and Confederate, and the Vice Presidency of our President of the Confederacy, who was good friends with Lincoln and had maintained a friendship, though strained by the war. They traveled to the Petersburg lines on December the 29th, or January the 29th. And my troops, soldiers, met them under flag of truce and turned them down. We didn't know anything about this. Then I get word from Washington, from the president, that there is going to be a peace commission, but it is to be of the utmost secrecy. I'm to say nothing. The least people possible are to know about it, and to let them come through the lines. Well, on January the 29th, a flag of truce goes up at Fort Damnation, as the rebels called it, under flag of truce. We received them, and they came over to what we called Fort Hell. And as they were walking across that open field, troops on both sides began to cheer, peace, 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 because they all knew what was going on. The secret was not really a secret. I received them at my City Point headquarters, and under directions from Secretary of War Stanton and the President, I put them aboard the Mary Martin, which was a Hudson River steamer that was at City Point, outfitted for passengers and most commodious. They were very comfortable, and I told them, I don't know how long you will be here, but you will be kept comfortable. Told the captain, furnish them with whatever they wanted. They did not have a guard on them. They didn't have to ask permission to leave the vessel. In fact, they frequently left the boat and came up to my City Point headquarters. Well, we chatted quite a bit. I liked them. And I'd like to point out, too, President Lincoln was fond of this anecdote. When he asked me, did you see Stevens? Yes, sir, I did. Did you see him before and after he took off that big overcoat, which was a rough wool thing, the kind that was being made in the Confederacy during the war because of poor materials and so forth? And I said, yes, sir, I did. And he said, did you notice how big he is? Alexander Stevens is 5 feet 7 inches tall, and he weighs 80 pounds. But he looks like a normal-sized man with that overcoat. And when he gets through taking all of it off, you really want to look around and to see where the man went, because he weighs 80 pounds and he's 5'7". But Lincoln said, isn't he the smallest cob out of the biggest shuck of corn that you ever saw? He really did like Stevens. He regretted the choice that Stevens made on which side he took. But they were on the Mary Martin at City Point with their freedom there. They weren't asked to take a pledge. They weren't asked to state their honor. They were trusted, and they abided by that. And on one of the troops, officers that had talked to them told President Lincoln they're hard-headed, they're not going to negotiate. And Lincoln was about to call it off. I had sent a telegram, though, and said, I have had a most pleasant conversation. They're well-intended, and it seems to me that they're willing to reunite the Union. On that advice, Secretary Seward, who was at Point Comfort at the time, aboard the River Queen, he notified President Lincoln we should talk, and that was on the morning of February the 2nd. Lincoln immediately left about 9:30 that morning and went to Fortress Monroe, and was taken out to the River Queen, a half mile out from Fortress Monroe. So he had been asked, are there Confederate peace commissioners and clamoring for him to tell them. And he said, no, to my knowledge, there are no Confederate peace commissioners in Washington City. They never set foot in Washington. They were on the boat, the Mary Martin, at City Point, and then they were transferred on February 3rd to the River Queen. President Lincoln got there, as I understand, about 10:30, and they spent about 4 hours. Now, as I understand, the conversation was Lincoln put them at ease, talked about family and friends, and then he got to the point. And Alexander Stephens said, "What's it going to take? What do we need to do?" And Lincoln told them, "Lay down your arms. Nothing else will do. You must lay down your arms and stop fighting." And what about France? What about joining the... Lincoln cut him off. He said, "That's not anything we're going to talk about. I'm not interested in that at all. I'm interested in putting the Union back together, you laying down your arms and stopping the killing, and that you recognize slavery is dead, and that you'll approve the 13th Amendment." And so Judge Campbell said, "We realized within 5 minutes the conditions and the full status of our negotiations. It was recognize the Union, stop fighting, embrace slavery being ended." Now, in their talking, President Lincoln did indicate that he was in favor of amnesty for the Confederate soldiers, and he was in favor of returning confiscated property except slaves. In fact, he said, "I'll write a proposition that I will give the Confederacy $400 million to pay for slaves," because as one White House official said, President Lincoln was a lawyer and he understood slaves were an economics issue in many ways, and he proposed giving the Confederacy $400 million to pay for the slaves, to ease that financial hole that they would be in. And he said $200 million if you stop fighting by April 1st, and another $200 million if you approve the 13th Amendment by July 1st. And he did indeed carry through. He went, after the conference, he went to the White House. He wrote that proposition, put it before his cabinet, and his cabinet panned it. He was very disappointed over that. But he had proposed paying for the slaves $400 million. He had was enthusiastic about amnesty and the returning of confiscated property except slaves. But his demands were recognize the Union and that we are one country. Stop fighting immediately and embrace that slavery is dead. So after that, after about 4 hours, they were brought back to City Point and then escorted under flag of truce back across the lines from Fort Hill to Fort Damnation, and they went back into Confederacy. And that matter was over. But, and they did agree that Stephens had a nephew that was held in the North, and President Lincoln agreed to release him in exchange for a federal officer being held in Richmond. So they had a prisoner exchange, and he agreed to direct me to work up a prisoner exchange that we could reinstitute since we had not been exchanging prisoners. The one issue that was resolved at the February 3rd, 65 peace conference was prisoner exchange. And perhaps resolved too is the firmness of the position that President Lincoln held. We are one country, accept the authority of the United States as a nation, one nation. Stop fighting, and slavery is over. I should like to share with you a couple of things, though, that give light to this whole matter. Lincoln said this about Jefferson Davis: "He affords us no excuse to deceive ourselves. He cannot voluntarily re-accept the Union. We cannot voluntarily yield it. They can, at any moment, have peace simply by laying down their arms and submitting to the national authority under the Constitution. If questions should remain, we would adjust them by the peaceful means of legislation, conference, courts, and votes, operating only in constitutional and lawful channels. In presenting the abandonment of armed resistance to the national authority on the part of the insurgents as the only indispensable condition to ending the war on the part of the government, I retract nothing heretofore said as to slavery. I repeat the declaration made a year ago that, while I remain in my present position, I shall not attempt to retract or modify the Emancipation Proclamation, nor shall I return to slavery any person who is free by the terms of that proclamation or by any acts of Congress." I should like to remind you that at that moment of the peace conference in February 3rd of 65, there were already 200,000 free blacks now as a result of what we had done in the war. And Lincoln made it clear to Stevens and the Peace Commission, they are not going back into slavery. Now, Lincoln did promise to issue a proposal, resolution for amnesty. And after returning to Washington, he wrote an amnesty resolution offering pardons and return of confiscated property except slaves. The resolution stipulated, as I said earlier, that the Confederacy would receive $200 million if they quit fighting before April 1st, and they would receive another $200 million if they approved the 13th Amendment before July 1st. The cabinet panned it. It was not adopted. Now, on April the 5th, President Lincoln gave this statement to Judge Campbell in Richmond. In fact, Judge Campbell visited with Lincoln after Richmond fell on April the 2nd. On April the 5th, President Lincoln said this to Campbell: "As to peace, I have said before, and now repeat, that three things are indispensable: the restoration of the national authority throughout the United States, no receding by the executive of the United States on the slavery question from the position assumed thereon in the last annual message and in preceding documents, and no cessation of hostilities short of an end of the war and the disbanding of all forces hostile to the government, that all propositions coming from those now in hostility to the government not inconsistent with the foregoing will be respectfully considered and passed upon in a spirit of sincere liberality." And that was April the 5th. April the 9th, Lee surrendered to me and the war was essentially, effectively over. Now, something that should be remembered about that conference, it was late in the war, indeed just days before the war was to be over. Lincoln had the upper hand from any position which you wish to view his situation. Yet he consented to negotiate with the Confederate Peace Commission, hoping if by day we could stop this killing, that lives would be saved, men would not be wounded, property would not be destroyed. He demonstrated profoundly, without saying anything, what a kind and generous man, caring man that he was, because it was so late in the war. Unfortunately, the South was intransigent, and that intransigency was not to be overcome. And we fought until the end. But that's all I have to say at this time about the Peace Conference of February the 3rd of 1865. I'm glad you saw fit to join me this day, and I look forward to coming together with you again when you join me in my parlor or, indeed, in the library, and I reflect once again about a person, a place, or an event in the American Civil War. I'm Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, and I bid you a fond, for the moment, farewell.